let me begin tonight's lecture. And tonight's lecture is going to be called Albrecht Dürer. That's the American pronunciation. German would be closer to Albrecht Dürer, pioneer of the Northern Renaissance. So you've heard of the Renaissance. You know what that is, this flourishing of artistic technique and human culture that takes place down in mostly northern Italy in the 1300s. We call the Northern Renaissance that extent of the Renaissance that takes place north of the Alps. And Dürer is probably the best example of that Northern Renaissance. He's alternately considered perhaps the greatest German Renaissance artist, perhaps simply the greatest German artist. And he's certainly the one who brings Italian Renaissance style paintings to the north of the Alps. So we're going to be looking at his work. And because everything that we do here at Aqueduct Project touches on the themes of the unity of the church, this lecture is also going to have as its sub-theme the unity of the church. And we're going to look at how Albrecht Dürer visually portrays sort of this new coming together of, or this question that these new artistic techniques that come forth of the Renaissance, the question of what to do with those techniques. So the Protestants sort of develop one response to the Renaissance. The Roman Catholics develop another response to the Renaissance. And we're going to watch the struggle in Dürer as he responds with both parts of those culture and it sort of sits at the center of that parting of the ways that will ultimately be characterized in how Protestants respond to the Renaissance and how Catholics respond to the Renaissance. First, though, let me very quickly, let me say thank you so much for joining us. This is a benefit lecture for Aqueduct Project. Many of you are supporters for Aqueduct Project, and this is my way of saying thank you and getting this group together. You volunteer, you donate time, you donate finances, you lead in one capacity or another. So I want to say thank you to those of you who make Aqueduct Project possible. And I want to very briefly celebrate with you some of the things that have been taking place in our prayer rooms. So very, very briefly, let me share with you what's been going on in our prayer rooms. Hey, we have 10 prayer rooms, actually 11 prayer rooms. And would you join us in praying about doubling that? One of the things that we're trying to do in the next 1 or 2 years is to see if we can double that. And God has blessed our prayer rooms in a really crazy, beautiful way these last several years. Technically, we've run them since 2016, about the Christmas season of 2016. But since COVID and the pandemic, the numbers of people who've been joining us in prayer on these prayer rooms have been skyrocketing. So I checked a couple days ago, and the statistic that I have been using as sort of a measuring rod to see how our prayer rooms is doing is looking to see how many people have come into any one of these prayer rooms over the last 12 months. And I checked that number a couple days ago, and there were over 160,000 Zoom callers who've been joining us over the last 12 months. Those are not unique individuals. They're many repeat users, but that is a ton of people. And we simply give the glory to God and are rejoicing that God has used this humble instrument, this humble platform, as a way to bring his people together in prayer to access God's own power. Those 160,000 Zoom callers have logged a cumulative nearly 8 million minutes of prayer. So 7,749,000 minutes of prayer. And we're simply grateful to God for that growth, and we're thankful to you, our human community, that also makes that possible, our supporters and those who lead with us. So we're really, really grateful. All right, so let's dive in. I love preparing and delivering these lectures on art history. For the last couple months, I've been developing benefit lectures for Aqueduct Project, and all of them have been themed around art. And I'll tell you why, not just because I happen to have the opportunity to bum around European art museums since I've been located here in Marburg, and I do love museums, so I've been at a number of really, really great art museums. But it's also something that translates, art appreciation is also something that translates pretty well to an online environment. And one of the themes, too, that you know if you've been walking with Aqueduct Project for any point in time is we're really trying to see what we can do to develop, to apply emerging technology for the purposes of Christian ministry. Prayer works great online. That's been tested and proven, and we want to continue to develop that. Art appreciation as a manner of education works pretty well too. So I've been exploring trying to make these visually rich presentations, and art appreciation is something we can do pretty well together online. The slides that I'm going to show you have come from 4 different world-class museums, 2 in Nuremberg, one called the German National Museum, and then the Albrecht Dürer House is also in Nuremberg. And then a couple of the pictures that I'll be showing you, I took from the Städtel Museum in Frankfurt, and then also the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. So I'm going to be putting pictures together from several different museums to make this presentation possible. My opening statement on Albrecht Dürer is we often hear that the Renaissance changed everything in the art world. Sometimes it's easier to understand what that change was by seeing an image rather than by having a verbal description of what takes place. The German National Museum, which these pictures are from here, is one of Europe's greater treasure troves of medieval art. This is one of the buildings in the museum complex that you're seeing here was originally a cloister. It was a monastery. And in the year 1525, Nuremberg converted to Protestantism, and the convent was given over to the Lutheran movement. And since then, it's traded hands and it's become part of the German National Museum. When we look at medieval art, sometimes we can see the greatest differences between what is taking place in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance art. Here's a statue, St. Christopher, from the German National Museum. It's a medieval piece. Unfortunately, it's not survived terribly well. It's a little bit misshapen. Elements have treated it badly. I've taken this picture as sort of a symbol of medieval art. Medieval art is very often commissioned by the church for the purposes of decorating churches. This statue here, St. Christopher, was to decorate a church, presumably. It's sacred art, and we very seldom know who painted or created this piece of art. Very often, medieval art is anonymous. When we come to the Renaissance, we're looking at something really, really different. This is created in 1500. This is Albrecht Dürer's most famous piece, his self-portrait. When we come to this, we're just looking at an entirely different world. This has a level of realism and power that is unmatched by anything that we can find in the Middle Ages. Dürer spent months developing this portrait. No matter how close you get to it, the detail level is truly unbelievable. It's just incredible. And Dürer here stands in this incredibly bold position. So many art historians will look at this exact piece and say, this is the piece where we can see the Renaissance has arrived. Okay, the artist is not an anonymous craftsman anymore, like he was in the Middle Ages, serving a commission, serving the church necessarily. This is not a sacred piece of art, and it's not anonymous. Albrecht Dürer has put his name in it, and that you see up right here to the right. You see that Latin inscription here. I, Albrecht Dürer, when I was 28 years old, portrayed myself in real likeness, in my 28th year. It's not anonymous. He's clearly understanding the power of his own art and its importance. The artist has become a little bit of a rock star. The artist has become a person who's important. We see a gigantic change between this and the art of the Middle Ages. Dürer is sometimes likened to Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man. Give me just a minute to make a few comments, and then we'll look at a few medieval pieces of art. Leonardo da Vinci is, of course, the Renaissance person, the Renaissance man. And there's a number of very interesting parallels between the life and the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer. Leonardo da Vinci is a little bit older. He's most of a generation Albrecht Dürer's senior, but they both worked in an astonishing number of media. They're not, they both paint, of course, but both of them dabble or produce masterpieces in a number of different media. Dürer, he does a lot of paintings, but he also does a lot of print work. As we'll note, he was involved very early in the print industry and actually developed his sort of financial foundation in his earlier works through print media and the selling of his prints. He developed some really sophisticated woodcuts. He also was trained as a goldsmith, and his early work is as a goldsmith. But they do both of them do their most iconic paintings. Leonardo da Vinci and Dürer probably do their most iconic pieces in paint. This is Dürer's most iconic piece. Leonardo da Vinci's presumably would be the Mona Lisa. Portrait becomes very, very important in the Renaissance period, and Dürer has a strong hand in shaping that importance. But this particular portrait is too bold to really become for any other artist or anybody else to follow him. So this style where the person portrayed stares directly into the face of the person viewing, that was just too bold for other portrait painters to be able to follow. And what many people point out too is that Dürer has painted himself perhaps in the very image of Christ. So Dürer appears to have had long, lengthy, curly hair as portrayed here, that we've come to think of as a mark of Christ because we're so affected by Renaissance portrayals of Christ, but also the way that Dürer is holding his hand. You'll very often see Christ holding his hand that way too in portrait or in iconography, and that's a sign of blessing. So it's very nearly the same finger posture that we would imagine Christ showing in an icon. And what exactly Dürer's intention there is not clear, but it's too bold of a painting for most other painters to have been able to follow. Let's look at a couple, before we go and take a tour of Dürer's work, I just want to show you a couple other medieval pieces, just so we can begin to see some of this changeover that takes place with Dürer. This is another masterpiece. This also comes from the Germanic National Museum in Nuremberg. This is by Veitstoß. We happen to have something of an expert with us on Veitstoß. That's my father-in-law, Christoph. So glad you're with us too, Papa. I won't put you on the spot, won't request that you speak to us, but I've had a number of tours with my father-in-law through spaces in Nuremberg. For a number of years, he's given tours of different churches as well. This is a piece by Veitstoß, a wood statue, Madonna, the mother of Jesus. There's a lot of emotion to it, a lot of beauty. Veitstoß completed this in about 1500, shortly after he returned from Krakow, Poland. He returned to Nuremberg in 1496. And aside from the obvious beauty of the image, it's quite clear this is a piece of sacred art. This is a devotional piece. We're meant to stand in front of the image and contemplate our relationship to Mary or to the Christ child. This is the pear. It's a pear that the Christ child is holding down at his foot, and I just show that to show the detail on every part of it. The folds in the garment, I think Veitstoß is showing off his ability to show the drapery there with such style. Great. Let's look at another piece briefly. This is Christ on a foal. I'll look at two other pieces and then draw some remarks here in a moment. Christ on a foal, also from Veitstoß, or the apprentices of Veitstoß. So he had a workshop in Nuremberg around the same year, around 1505. This piece presumably was to be put on a wagon, and then on the Palm Sunday procession into the city of Nuremberg, I suppose we would see this statue pulled along as people would enter the church on Palm Sunday. It's about 4 feet high or so. Beautiful wood carving. Many will note the sort of anatomical precision there in the animal itself. Great. Beautiful piece. I'll draw some comments together in a moment. Let's look at one other example of medieval art. This is from considerably earlier. This is an antipendium. I also had to look up what an antipendium is, so don't feel bad if you don't know what an antipendium is. It's a something that you would put on the front of an altar to decorate an altar. So this is that's about the size of a medium-sized table, and that would cover the front of the altar. So if you were in the congregation looking forward to the altar in the church, this is what you would see of the altar. And we're going to get in detail in here just a minute, but let me point out we've got 12 apostles, these 3 figures in each corner, flanking the corners, Christ in the center. We have the dove of the Holy Spirit up here descending on Christ. And then we have the 4 evangelists, the eagle, the ox, the lion, and the man. So that's the basic symbology there of the altar. Let's get in close. I was really testing to see if my camera could get close-up shots on this image. That's about a 3-inch high head. And yes, actually, I love doing art appreciation online this way because I can see the image better than I actually can when I'm really in the museum. So I like finally to look at my images to see what they really look like. This is a wood carving that has metal over top. Here are the 12 apostles. Presumably, the 12 apostles can be identified. I haven't gone to all the work to look at each one in detail carefully enough to be able to pick out the symbols that the artist is trying to communicate the identity of each apostle, but presumably they do have specific identities. Now, here as we move in, let's go in and look at the four evangelists here. You may know this, each of the evangelists has a symbol attached to it. The story there, well, let me give you the 4 images and then give the story. So that the eagle here that you see is meant to represent John. And very often, if you're looking at a piece of medieval art and you've got the artist has an opportunity with, the corners of a square, corners of something to depict 4 of something, probably the artist is going to land on the idea of depicting the 4 evangelists, the author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the traditional way of depicting the evangelists will be to use the image of the ox for Luke. Here's Luke, the eagle for John, the lion for Matthew, and the man for Mark. There's actually a couple different systems. There's a couple different ways that can pan out, but usually that's the way that those 4 animals are attributed or characters are attributed to the 4 evangelists. And where does that come from? Well, you might possibly remember in the 4 living creatures. The 4 living creatures show up in the prophecy in Revelation, but they originally show up in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 1. And there we have 4 living creatures, the same living creatures here, the eagle, the ox, the lion, and the man. And pretty early in church history, in about the 2nd century with Irenaeus, it's pretty clear that people were doing this at that time. They landed on the symbolism of those 4 living creatures having the significance of the 4 evangelists. The church fathers have different ways of explaining the significance of this. The explanation that Irenaeus uses and that I prefer is John is considered to be the eagle, and Irenaeus tells us that's because the eagle has sort of the high view of everything, just like the Gospel of John stands out from the synoptic Gospels because of its spiritual sort of the high vantage point, seeing sort of the high reality of what's taking place with the Christ. The ox, well, it's a little harder to pin to Luke, but Zechariah, in the story of Zechariah and his officiation of sacrifices in the temple, that begins the Gospel of Luke. So the church fathers tell us that Luke is parallel to the Gospel of, or Luke is parallel to the ox. The lion and the eagle actually bounce around a little bit to different people, but usually that will settle on Matthew because Matthew portrays the kingly Christ, and so the lion representing the kingly figure, and the man because it's Mark who shows this has a very simple gospel showing the humanity of Christ in a very simple way. So there we go. And then at the very center, we have the dove of the Holy Spirit descending on Christ. Okay, so thanks for exploring a couple medieval pieces with me. What could we say about these medieval pieces of art? Well, we could say that medieval art is usually anonymous, and that holds true for a couple of these pieces. We don't know who created the Xantipendium. We do, in fact, know that Veit Stoss's studio created the other two that we looked at. But usually medieval art is anonymous. It's almost always sacred. It's commissioned by churches, and it's created to decorate churches. That's almost always the case. That won't be the case in the Renaissance, and that won't be the case with many of Dürer's pieces, although Dürer does do some sacred art as well. And we could also say that, when we look at these other pieces, the Christ on a foal, that was clearly meant for a church procession on a holy day. This piece here is to decorate an altar. The Madonna was presumably to be used in a church sanctuary. So the theme of sacred art is very, very clear. When we get to Dürer, that will be a little different. I'm just going to show you a few pictures here of the Albrecht Dürer house. We actually have the house still standing, and is a wonderful museum that Albrecht Dürer lived in. He bought the house in 1509, built his studio there. You can still see a beautiful statue of Albrecht Dürer down in that part of the town of Nuremberg as you approach the Dürer house. Here it is, as I visited it with my father-in-law a couple weeks ago, well, 2 months ago or so. Very little of Dürer's actual work is still here to be found. Dürer had the mixed blessing of being too famous during his own day and his artwork being too prized, and very little of it was retained in Nuremberg up through the years. So there is the German National Museum, which is a really a world-class museum. They've retained a number of important pieces, but Dürer's pieces are all over the world, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna and in the Prado. So his pieces are really scattered very broadly and very difficult to get to see all at once. But we did have a lovely visit to the Nuremberg's Dürer house. And I was reminded while I was there of how important so many connections that Dürer had with the people of his part of the town. There were people who had created the earliest globe were nearby. Dürer's own godfather, appointed at Dürer's baptism, was Anton Coburger, who was one of the most successful printers in the early age of print. Anton Coburger had a print shop running having about 100 employees with 40 printing presses. Anton Coburger might have been the earliest very successful printer, and had a direct relationship with Dürer, and helped launch his own career as a print in woodcut. Dürer was raised in a pious Roman Catholic family, and religion was a real important part of his family life. So we get a taste of Dürer's. This museum had some exhibits containing something on his early life. Dürer didn't come into this house until 1509, at which time he was already a somewhat prosperous artist, and this is where he set up his studio and developed most of his pieces. His very earliest piece that we have is of his mother and father. So let's go ahead and look quickly at these. This is at the German National Museum. You'll note at the bottom right-hand corner of both the portrait of his father and mother, the subject is fingering, what's that? A rosary. Okay, so Dürer is showing his mother to be a pious woman, pious Roman Catholic, by including this rosary in the actual piece. This was created in 1490. Well, Martin Luther is only 7 years old at the time that this print is executed. So the Reformation has not yet begun. Okay. Barbara is the name of his mother. She had 18 children. Oh my goodness. There were some things about the Middle Ages that were not easy. 18 children, 3 of them survived until later age. Note here, this is also an early piece. I was not able to get my eyes on this photograph, so I had to go to Wikipedia to get this picture here. But something else that we can learn about Dürer's early years is he was apprenticed by his father as a goldsmith. And this is a piece that he did later. This is, this is a good number of years later that he produced this. I'm sorry, I lost the year, but I think this is about a 1510 or so painting. And Dürer has put himself into the painting. This is the 3 wise men, or the 3 kings, paying homage to the infant Christ. Here's Mary and Joseph and Christ and 3 kings. And Dürer has painted himself as one of the kings. That's his image there that he's placed himself in. And he's also gone to great lengths to show the extent of his the gold adornment on this king. And because we remember that Dürer was apprenticed as a goldsmith in his early years, we're pretty sure that he took great delight in making all of this gold finery and putting it onto this king. Yes, Dürer worked in his father's shop when he was 12 years old and learned goldsmithing. That was his first trade. It's there that he developed, we're quite sure it's there that he developed his knack for really, really fine drawings. This is the earliest piece of Dürer at all that we have. This is a piece that he drew. It's a self-portrait that he drew of himself when he was 13. And the detail work is very impressive, especially when you think that he did it as a 13-year-old. He must have learned that fine etch work, which becomes something of his signature piece in his father's goldsmith shop. We can see that really, really fine brushwork working elsewhere. This is his young hair, which if you didn't know it was Dürer, you'll recognize it. You know this piece. And if you can get in close again, I didn't have the privilege of seeing this piece with my own eyes, so I couldn't get my own camera on it either. And I don't have a very good quality picture of it. But if you zoom into that, the detail is quite exquisite. The brushwork is extraordinary. We can see that same technique in this image, also, which I didn't get a chance to see in person. So this is also a stock shot. But the praying hands, you'll remember too. You'll certainly know this. And this is also Dürer's piece. This is probably Dürer's most famous or most recognized piece. And again, that very fine detail work is again a part of what makes that image vivid and memorable. He learned that in his father's goldsmith shop. Here's a portrait of his father. This is also one that I didn't get to see, so I need to make that disclaimer here as well too. But I want to draw your attention to, this is Albrecht Dürer Sr. So Dürer is the junior, named for his father. What I want to show you is that he also was portrayed here with these rosary beads. The family was very pious, and we're going to watch this sort of as the Reformation rolls in to Nuremberg. We're going to begin to watch how that begins to change some of Dürer's paintings. Now, Dürer didn't stay a goldsmith. He was later, he had to ask his father, he sort of had to plead to get out of the goldsmithing business, but joined Michael Wohlgemuth, who was another Nuremberg native, not far away from where they were living. And Wohlgemuth was a painter, had the best painting studio in Nuremberg. This piece here, which I did get to see, executed in 1516, was 30 years after Dürer worked with him. So he left his print shop, well, actually in 1489. Almost 30 years later, Dürer made this painting as a tribute to his painting teacher. And there's a touching note there in the top right-hand corner. It says, this is what the inscription reads. This portrait was made by Albrecht Dürer of his teacher Michael Wohlgemuth in the year 1516. And then 3 years later, Wohlgemuth died, and Dürer went back to the painting and added into the inscription. And he was 82 years old and lived until 1519. It was then that he passed away on St. Andrew's Day in the morning before the sun rose. Well, there's a touching tribute from Dürer back to his teacher some 30 years earlier. He learned painting from Michael Wolgemuth. He didn't just learn painting. Wolgemuth also had, he was also especially known for his woodcuts. And that's going to be part of this multimedia journey that Dürer is on and developing his art form in a number of different ways. Let's dive into one of Dürer's signature pieces and spend a little bit more time exploring visually what's going on here too. This is the painting executed in 1511 or 1513 of Emperor Charlemagne. So this is also in Nuremberg. It's also maybe one of the most important pieces or one of the more important pieces in the whole museum. And this painting, we're getting a little closer to the Reformation. The Reformation, so 1513, still a couple years before Martin Luther is going to tack his 95 Theses on the wall, the door Church of Wittenberg, but we're getting closer to that period. In fact, these paintings were created as part of the solemnification of a showcasing of relics. Let me unpack that a little bit. So in the city of Nuremberg, there were some relics treasured there by the church. There was a holy lance, and then there were some state relics, the imperial crown, an imperial sword. Many have sort of pointed out that these were a form of relics. These items were displayed on the town square in Nuremberg once a year. And the night before these relics were displayed before the town, they were kept in a sort of shrine, a way of reinforcing the holiness and the sacredness, the specialness of these objects. And Albrecht Dürer was asked to paint these huge paintings. Each are about 2.5 meters tall. They're very large paintings for the cases behind which the relics would be held. So sort of the high point of this shrine that where the relics would be stored before they'd be shown to the people. Now, that was the official use of these paintings, but the paintings were only in service for about 12 years, because in 1525, the Reformation, Luther's Reformation, is going to be adopted by the city councils in Nuremberg, and then there's going to be no more displaying of relics. So these paintings would go out of official use after only about 12 years of service. This rather funny-looking king here is Sigismund, and that is the man who brought these relics to Nuremberg in 1424. So he's celebrated there as the person who brought the relics to the city. This painting here is of Charlemagne, and that's the painting that we're going to look at together. Okay. We have, again, Dürer shows off his knowledge and skill in gold working, sort of virtual creation of jewelry here in his painting. Charlemagne, of course, the founder of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, a tremendously celebrated figure during the Renaissance as well. The detail is extraordinary. We're very, very close in the image at that point. Symbol of the empire. And very impressive personification of Charlemagne. Of course, there is no known image of what Charlemagne really would have looked like. Einhard, his biographer, has a verbal description, which probably Dürer was aware of and probably used, but there's no actual visual description there of Charlemagne. So that's completely from Dürer's imagination. As the again, this image here, I didn't have an opportunity to see, so I can only show you a very basic image of it. This is, as we move into the theme of the Renaissance, let me backtrack briefly and share about how it is that Dürer got caught up into these changes that took place in the Reformation. This is a portrait of Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony. And maybe that name doesn't mean too much to you, but that's the name of the potentate who became the protectorate of Martin Luther. So one of the reasons why in God's providence the Reformation had such success is because this man, Frederick the Wise, took a personal interest in defending Martin Luther and supporting the early Reformation. So you probably do remember the famous story about how Luther was kidnapped after the Diet of Worms and taken to the Wartburg, and there held where he, unknown to the people around him, where he was held in captive, a secret captivity, secret kidnapping, and then where he translated the New Testament into German. Well, this was Frederick the Wise's doing that Luther came into under his protection into the Wartburg. Dürer had an opportunity to meet Frederick the Wise in 1496 and painted this painting at that time. It was at that time that Frederick the Wise was on business in Nuremberg, and they had a chance to meet. In fact, Frederick the Wise at one time was thought to be a candidate for being Holy Roman Emperor. So Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor during the time of the Reformation. History could have been written differently. It could have been this guy, and that would have meant a very, very different time as the Reformation unfolded. But Dürer became something of an acquaintance, something of a friend with Frederick the Wise, and had a number of interactions through his life. Also, this portrait may have been the reason why Dürer's early career was so accelerated, because Frederick the Wise was quite enthusiastic about Dürer's work, solicited Dürer to have his own painting done, and that was the beginning of sort of Dürer's extreme popularity, because he became very much in demand after such an important figure signaled his affirmation of his work. Dürer also had the opportunity to travel to the Diet of Augsburg in 1518. So again, we see this sort of interweaving of the themes of the Reformation in Dürer's life. It was in Augsburg in 1518 that Luther defended his teachings before the very salty Cardinal Cajetan. And Luther only escaped because he was let out of the city at night. So Dürer was very impressed with Luther and his boldness. Dürer even dreamed of painting Luther's a portrait. Never got an opportunity to do that. He did get an opportunity to develop portraiture for other humanists and other reformers. Probably his most famous is his portrait of Erasmus of Rotterdam. But Dürer was very impressed with Luther. But of course, there was this tension here, because some of the early streams of the Reformation were also notably iconoclastic. So for an artist who makes his whole livelihood and career in the pursuit of visual portraiture, visual beauty, there was some difficulty in aligning with the Reformation, given that so many streams of it were iconoclastic. Luther himself was never iconoclastic. Luther is remembered as saying, "Tear the images out of your hearts, but not out of your altars." And for Dürer and a few others, they were able to walk this fine line between full allegiance to early Protestantism and yet full allegiance to developing Renaissance art. I've got another image for you here, and I'm going to turn on some music as we explore this. Maybe just a little bit of we're more than halfway through, but I thought I wanted to have a little, just to change things up a little bit. So I'd like to add a little music here as I show you the images from the Lamentation of Christ. Dürer has two pieces called the Lamentation of Christ, created at about the same time. This is the one that's housed in Nuremberg, and I was able to see this and explore this with my camera. Let me explain some of the imagery, and then I'll show the images, and we'll simply look at it as the music plays together. But let's, first of all, before we explore it, let me show you what we're looking at. This is, of course, Christ in the figure who's been crucified and who is very recently deceased. The figures around him are John the Apostle, this young man looking down, John the Apostle. We remember the story of Jesus asking John to care for his mother. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus, who's weeping here. This older man here, I'm not actually sure who that is. So I'd have to go dig up who that is. There's a few other characters I can't easily identify, but that's John and that's Mary. Note that we have red and blue as prominent themes in the depiction here. There are different theories, but usually in Christian iconography, usually blue represents divinity. You can think of the blue of the heavens and the blue of the sky, if you're trying to remember that. And usually red represents humanity. So you can think of a drop of blood or something if you want to put that in your memory. So I think that Dürer is very clearly playing with the colors here of red and blue to symbolize Christ's own humanity and divinity coming together. Who are these other figures? Well, first of all, look at all these little figures down here. Those are the nobles who commissioned this painting. So we'll get a shot at those two. It may seem strange to you that the figures here are so much smaller than the main figures above, but so be it. You'll notice this is pretty early in this is pre-Reformation, so a number of these figures will be fingering rosaries as well. These are the Roman Catholic nobles who paid for the painting. Up here, this man is presumably Nicodemus. We read in the story of the crucifixion in the Gospel of John that Nicodemus comes with 75 pounds of spices for the burial. So that's what he must be carrying there in that large flask and container, is a lot of spices for the burial. This woman, I presume here to be Mary Magdalene. I suppose she could be too, but I think this must be Mary Magdalene because of her red and blue colors and the more prominent standing. I don't know who this woman is here wailing. Maybe that is Mary Magdalene, remembering that it was Mary who held onto the feet of the Lord when he was raised. Then we're going to also see some scenes above here. This is of course, the crucifixion and the Roman centurion standing watch. This is a devotional piece. One of the things that I've been fascinated with as I've had the opportunity to spend time contemplating art in these art museums is I begin to see that the picture is meant to be seen in a number of stages. I always thought that paintings were sort of like photographic images. And of course, any of you who've painted know immediately that that's terribly wrong. There's very little in common between a painting and a photograph. But I had presumed that a painting was like an image. You're supposed to be able to see it all at once. And in fact, no, that's not the case. A painting is meant to be seen in stages. You walk through it or you journey with it. It unfolds in a series of stages. And this is a devotional piece. One is meant not just to be told the stories as one walks through this painting, but one's meant to connect to the emotion of it. And in Dürer's portfolio, this is one of the pieces where he's showing a lot of emotion in the work that he does in this painting. It's a devotional image. It's meant to actually create an emotional connection with the story. Now, I was trying to think, how can we experience today a devotional image? Well, I hope this works. It's a little bit of an experiment. Be patient with me. But my thought was most people in our culture or our context, when we want to have a devotional moment, it's something analogous to what was meant to be experienced in a devotional painting. We turn on a piece of worship music. Okay, that's the way that we create an emotional experience as a spiritual experience. Now, these folks here are doing it with the eyes, not the ears, but I'm going to play a piece by Fernando Ortega, a classic song you'll recognize, How Great the Father's Love, and simply let the images roll. I will follow through the journey of the painting as the painting unfolds. So I'll move through that sequence as I think is natural according to the painting. I won't try to synchronize the images to the words of the music. I'll let the painting determine our sequence through the piece, but I hope it's a pleasant and an experience for you to connect to this piece of art the way we connect to devotional pieces, which is usually through music. I hope that's an effective way for you to connect to this painting today. Thanks for joining me in that little experiment of trying to translate a medieval or a Renaissance devotional piece into our own context. Appreciate that. Boy, I got to fly. I've got, 20 minutes here and I've got a bunch of stuff to figure out. Okay. So we're going to have to really throw this into high gear, but we'll get done in here maybe 20 minutes or so. But we will move quickly. The only piece that I have for you from the Städtel Museum, which is an amazing collection in Frankfurt, is Job on the Dung Heap. And really the only observation that I wanted to make about this is that we see a lot of classical influence in Dürer's work. Dürer was subscribed to the theory of the humors, that there's 4 basic humors that depending on their composition, sort of deeply influence our personality. The 4 humors, you may remember, are choleric, meaning angry. There's the melancholic, meaning depressive. There is the sanguine, youth and bubbly and happy. And there is the phlegmatic, or sort of, what's the right word there? Phlegmatic, sort of blasé, okay, lack of energy, perhaps. Dürer was convinced that he was melancholic, and he did probably have bouts of depression. He saw himself as, as a part of his medical history. He had a discharge of black bile when he was in his 20s, and was convinced that that was revealing that he was a melancholic person, that black bile, according to the medical theory of the day, demonstrated him to be a melancholic. And through all his pursuit of art, he very often felt that he could not achieve what he was trying to do. He very often felt very dissatisfied with his own abilities and his own accomplishments. He was, we remember as the most celebrated author of the German Renaissance, but he did not apparently feel that success all the time. So this is a little bit of a depiction of himself, perhaps. Job on the dung heap here, being bathed by his wife to try to relieve his sores, and Job feeling quite miserable through it all. Okay. There's I want to take you to the 4 apostles and talk explicitly about this conversion experience of Nuremberg converting over to Protestantism, and what that meant for Dürer, and what that meant for art. Dürer's 4 apostles, this is the last piece that he created. It's his final work. It's finished in 1526. He begins it several years earlier, as early as 1517, but he doesn't finish it until 1526. And this is about a year after Nuremberg has converted over to Protestantism. Now, I find that fascinating. What does it mean that a city converts over to Protestantism? What it means is that the city council gathers and votes that the city would convert to Protestantism. So 1 year after that happening, Philip Melanchthon had come to Nuremberg. Philip Melanchthon was sort of Luther's right-hand man in the administration of the Reformation. So Philip Melanchthon comes to Nuremberg in 1524. Philip Melanchthon and Dürer get to know each other quite a bit. Melanchthon is actually through Melanchthon that we sort of understand that this conversion of Dürer was sincere. He wasn't just doing it because it was politically expedient, but this was actually something from his own conviction. We understand that to be the case through Melanchthon, who is convinced that that was true. And Dürer creates this piece a year after the conversion of Nuremberg to the Reformation as a way of demonstrating his clear allegiance to the Reformation. Now, for a long time, I puzzled over how this image can show us Dürer's own conviction that the Reformation was correct. Most of that conviction is shown in the inscription in the bottom. So most of that's not visually represented, but represented in the inscription in the bottom. But as Dürer's last piece, let's take a quick moment at it. This is called the 4 apostles. The 4 people in the painting are John, Peter, Mark, and Paul. And so, many will point out that this is also a depiction of the 4 temperaments. Look at this. We have so let's go over here. We have John the Apostle, looking young and fair and sanguine. We have Peter here, portrayed as a phlegmatic character, sort of enervated, lack of energy, and looking sort of down on his luck almost. Catholic commentators will look at this and say, well, remember, Peter's supposed to be the head apostle. And so this portrait of Peter in a very disempowered position also maybe is a symbol there that of Dürer's allegiance with the Reformation. We can tell that that is John and Peter. Certainly we can tell that's Peter because of this giant key that he's holding, which of course is a giveaway that we're talking about Peter here. And then on this side of the panel, Mark is thought to be the representation of a choleric person with his fiery eyes. That is thought to be the choleric personality. And then over here we have the melancholy Paul. And again, Dürer perhaps tipping his hand to that, seeing himself as a melancholic figure, casting the Apostle Paul, the chief scripture writer in the New Testament, in that role. Really, it's from the inscription at the base that we have. There's Paul holding a book. We can clearly identify that that's Paul and a sword. But it's really from the inscription in the base, which was executed by a master calligrapher. That we have a full confidence that Dürer is here giving us his indication that he's joined the Reformation fully in heart, so that the inscription at some length goes on to this painting here. These two paintings, the four apostles, is a gift that Dürer gives to the city council. That is the authority that has of late voted in the Reformation to the city, and Dürer is charging that community to hold true to the Word of God, anticipating that there's going to be trouble in the future, that there's going to be a sort of a clash between there's going to be a backlash here in this decision the city's made, and Dürer is charging the city elders to hold true to the Word of God as the only authority in their decision making. Dürer, as brilliant as he is, as powerful as he is in shaping Renaissance art, does not become the prominent figure shaping Protestant art. And I find that a bit of a puzzle. If Dürer is such the celebrated Renaissance art and a clear friend of the Reformation, why didn't he inspire more Protestant art coming up behind him? The short answer to that is that Protestants, by and large, became iconoclastic, even despite Luther's considerations to the contrary, that cast the idols out of your heart, cast the images out of your heart, not out of your altars. Despite Luther holding to the proper use of imagery, most streams of Protestantism remained quite shy of the visual arts. If anybody stepped into that place of becoming sort of the pioneer, the leading pioneer of Protestant art, it was Lucas Cranach. So let me look at one painting of his before we get ready to conclude tonight's lecture. But this I take to be a much more typical expression of what happens in Protestant art, not Dürer's self-portrait and this extraordinary and passionate pursuit of beauty, but something of a very different nature. These pictures that I've taken here are also from the German National Museum, and this is called The Allegory of Law and Grace by Lucas Cranach. Lucas Cranach, you may know from his other works, he did about 11 portraits of Martin Luther, so any of the portraiture of Martin Luther that you know is most famous is probably done by Lucas Cranach. And he also did this piece. What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at two very busy paintings. This on the left is an allegory of law. This on the right is an allegory of grace. Okay, and we're going to have to dive in to look at these pieces to get to understand what's going on, because it really is a very busy painting. Almost a painting that you read in symbols rather than in the emotive quality of what's taking place. Okay, here at the center of the painting is this poor guy who's being taunted or stabbed by death and the devil. Okay, this man does not look very happy. He looks quite miserable, hands flailing in the air as he runs away from death, taunting him, and the devil terrifying him. Okay. And where is this poor man running? Straight to hell. Oh my goodness. This is a very bleak painting. What's going on otherwise here in the painting? Well, Adam and Eve, our forefather and foremother, looking not so innocent and really quite helpless. They're in the background. This is why we got here. Okay. And these guys aren't really helping either. These are the lawyers and the doctors and the teachers of theology and those who are explaining the law. Okay, so here is this theologian here is holding on to the Ten Commandments, explaining the law, but doing really nothing to help this man's plight. And this is an allegory, of course, that law can explain to us the problem, but doesn't do anything to relieve the burden of temptation or these terrors that we experience in life, running away from death and the devil. Okay, Jesus in the top of this image sits enthroned as judge, and this is really a terrible thing that's taking place. Look how, too, on the left hand, you see this tree all withered and thorny, presumably like representing the thorns that grew up after the curse. Okay, let's transition from this really terrible scene to over here, where the tree begins to sprout life. And it's not just this tree that's alive, but look at what else this image has to say about life. Okay, so in the center of the image is Christ on a cross, spurting forth blood from his wounded side, and the dove of the Holy Spirit is being given as a gift, now received to the same man who seems not so terrified anymore, but seems at peace. And this figure here, John the Baptist, I'm told, I at first thought it was Christ, but no, that's John the Baptist, pointing up to the Lamb of God on the cross who takes away the sins of the world. Okay, let me back up so you can see the whole image there again. In the background, rather than Adam and Eve, parallel to Adam and Eve, what do we have here in the background here? Well, we have the story of the snake on the pole, the bronze snake on the pole that when lifted up, that's Mount Sinai. That's a Renaissance depiction of Mount Sinai. I don't think Mount Sinai historically looks anything like that, but it looks sort of like the Alps. And so a German artist might imagine that that's what Mount Sinai looks like. Okay, this is the story from the Pentateuch, the bronze serpent on the pole being held up and giving healing. Jesus is looking with compassion there on the man. There's the bronze snake. Here on the right-hand side, we see the resurrected Christ. This is a medieval or a Renaissance depiction there of a sarcophagus that's meant to be the tomb. You'll see in many medieval or Renaissance paintings, Jesus exiting what looks like a casket, and that's the way they understood the tomb to look. But there's the resurrected Christ in power, coming and defeating death and the devil. That's as good as St. George could have ever done to any dragon. That one's a goner. Okay, so Christ has defeated the devil, and there's the victorious lamb holding the banner. All right, it's a fascinating painting. Has an amazing lesson to teach us. Praise God for that. But as a piece of art, is really, really different than the sorts of art that we just looked at with Albrecht Dürer. I'm not sure how you read it, and I hope I'm doing justice to the painting, but when I contemplate this image, as I did for some time as I was in the museum, I read it. I didn't have much of an emotional connection to the imagery. I had an emotional connection to its meaning. So the painting I read is a set of symbols, and the set of symbols, as I explained there, have an incredibly powerful story to tell, the most powerful story. But I have to confess, I did not connect with the emotion that I witnessed in these people's faces or that I saw. I instead connected to the story as a set of symbols. This painting instructs, but it didn't connect to me in the same way that Dürer's paintings did. Now, as my time is coming to a close, I just want to share with about one last painting and try to summarize a couple of these thoughts. So I think what's taking place in this early period in the Renaissance is the difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism isn't just a difference in doctrine, it's also a different application of the Renaissance. Okay, so I told you that church unity would be at some part of this lecture, and here it is for you. The difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, I'm convinced, at this early time of Protestantism, wasn't merely a difference in doctrine, although of course there was a doctrinal expression of those differences. But I'm convinced that part of what was going on is this the new opportunities that were available through the new media of the day. And Protestants latched onto the printing press and ran with it and created a whole scientific tradition and approach to theology that still resounds around the world. Catholics had a different approach. They took a much more visual approach, a much more artistic approach to their expression of their understanding of the Christian tradition. And while Protestants did a lot in the publishing world, they actually did very, very little in the production of art. I think about this with me just for a minute. I've got one sort of story to see if I can bring this together. A couple years ago, I was at the Vatican Museum. These last slides that I'm showing you are from the Vatican Museum in Rome. And I was I was accompanying a group of students from Moody Bible Institute. At this time in my life, I had been to the Vatican Museum a couple of times, and I was really yearning for the opportunity to explore the museum untethered from a formal tour. So I asked the students for their permission if we could simply break up in groups, and I could help people get into whatever tour they were interested in, but if we didn't stick together as a single large group for the day. The students were obliging, so I helped get everybody sorted in whatever tour they were interested in. And then I had the whole day to wander around the museum. And it was literally one of the very best days of my life. I can literally look at that day and say, that was the day that I want to live over and over again. And I explored the halls of the museum. I got to know the museum really in the way that I was hoping to get to understand it a little bit better. And as the day was sort of coming to an end, I was fading, the day was fading after hours and hours of walking around. I revisited some of the pieces that I most wanted to see, and I found myself gravitating back to this piece. This is called the Belvedere Torso, and I was intrigued by it. It's of course a partial sculpture. Most of it's missing. We only have this fragment left. And I was told that Michelangelo studied this piece obsessively. So it was discovered outside of a property, a vineyard, which was called Belvedere. That's, I guess, where it got its name. It was discovered around 1430, just as the Vatican was starting to create its collections. So in the history of the Renaissance, the history of the difference between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, Luther was quite uninterested in what the Vatican was doing at that time, spending huge amounts of money building up their art collections, investing in art, investing in the latest in Renaissance art. And of course, one reading of what happened with the division between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism was St. Peter's Basilica itself. It was a church building project that literally split the church in half. It's an amazing church, but the sale of indulgence was meant to support the building of this gigantic Renaissance structure. And Luther and the early Protestants really had very little patience for that kind of expense and that kind of use of resources in building these extremely expensive but beautiful buildings. Michelangelo was intrigued by this. So this was in the Vatican's collection at a very early time. It was one of their founding pieces, and Michelangelo would study it. I came back at the end of my day at the Vatican Museum and was contemplating this image as well. And just as I was over here looking at it, snapping these pictures, I was so proud that I could get these pictures because usually it's just crowded, hundreds of people gathered around it. And I was so glad that I could see it without the crowds. As I was there, a school group came in. I think it was an Italian school group, and the woman who was leading the school children through as they gathered around, she held up a poster of the image of Christ from the Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel. And she said, "Children," I don't know why she was speaking English, but I think it was a group of Italian students. She was saying, maybe it was mixed nationalities. She was saying, "Children, look here at Christ's abdomen. Do you see any resemblance between this and the Belvedere torso?" And I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen this, never been told this, but she was absolutely right. This is from the Sistine Chapel, only a few hundred yards from the Belvedere torso, and I couldn't believe it. Michelangelo had taken that piece, that classic piece built by a Greek sculptor, probably 200 years before Christ, and put it in Christ. I couldn't believe it. And the parable came together for me. That's exactly what Michelangelo was doing. He was taking the best of his artistic resources, the best of the Renaissance abilities and capacities, and he was placing them literally in the body of Christ. What a beautiful parable for putting artistic resources to use in service and edification of the church, which is Christ's body. Well, as I was looking at that, I was thinking, yes, we have, with Albrecht Dürer, at this early period in the Renaissance, we see that Dürer did so many things that were influential for later artists, but he did not establish a form of art for early Protestantism. Early Protestantism became a little too iconoclastic to follow him in that. And it was left to Michelangelo and others to adopt the full resources of the Renaissance and to use them for the edification of the church. My personal encouragement to you and to those of you who partner with us at Aqueduct Project is, I think that's what we ought to be doing in our own day, taking the very best of the resources that we can. Of course, the new media of today is not print, it's not sculpture, it's virtual of one variety or another. And I take that as an inspiration from me, and I offer that to you too, that would Christ call us to use the best of our own resources today and put them into his body, as it were, to edify the church for his purposes.